When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As we get started with this episode, I invite you to reflect on the question of what is democracy? Certainly, it is a question that many American leaders have had to ruminate on over the years, and Abraham Lincoln is certainly no exception. Long before he accepted the role of chief executive in the midst of the greatest threat to the Union in the nation's history, Lincoln studied works from history as well as contemporaries to develop a conception of democracy that would prove to be his guiding star to bring the United States through the Civil War. My guest today, Alan C. Guelzo, is Senior Research Scholar at the Council of Humanities at Princeton University. He is the author of several books about the Civil War and early 19th century American history. He has been the recipient of the Lincoln Prize 3 times, the Guggenheim-Lehrman Prize for Military History, and many other honors. He lives in Pennsylvania. Alan's latest book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment, helps readers to understand how Lincoln came to formulate his concept of democracy and what insight this provides us in the present day. My thanks go to Alan for an amazing conversation, as well as to Micah Kelsey with Alfred A. Knopf for working to set up this interview. After these quick messages, we'll get to my discussion with Alan.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Alan, thank you so much for joining me for this episode and for speaking to us a little more about your book.
Well, I'm delighted that people want me to continue to say something more about the book instead of saying, all right, you've talked enough.
I know there's always more to say, and I know our listeners are going to benefit from your knowledge. So just to get us started, would you mind sharing kind of what your impetus was in writing this book? And given that your note at the beginning said that it took longer to complete than you had originally thought, it certainly sounds like, and it comes across in your work, that there was a passion that drove you in crafting it.
Well, I think the most general environment that shaped this book is the sense of anxiety that has been in the minds of many people over the last several years about the future and the fate of democracy, the survivability of democracy. That certainly has been a question at the forefront of minds, not only in the United States, but really around the world. Back in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and then after that, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it really seemed as though democracy was the only real living, viable alternative, that we had arrived, as Francis Fukuyama said, at the end of history. We'd realized the teleological endpoint, and it was democracy. And that seemed to be the only way that we were going to think about going forward. And when you reflect on what happened over the ensuing 30 years, one disaster after another occurred. So you had the rise of what Samuel Huntington called a clash, not of politics, but of civilizations, especially religious cultures. You had the resurrection of an authoritarian regime in Russia. And then you had the extraordinary strength and strengthening of a totalitarian regime in China. You had the failure of democratic experiments in place after place around the world, so much so that last year, the estimates of what was happening in terms of democracy around the world had it declining to something like perhaps a quarter of the governments that govern various nations around the world. Only about a quarter of them could really be deemed democratic. That's a very serious wake-up call. And it has made people wonder whether this democratic experiment, in fact, has some severe flaws in it, is much more short-lived, and requires something else to either supplement it or replace it. So that's a lot of the general political environment in which we've been living and breathing over these last 3 decades. I wanted to write this book to address that sense of desperation, that sense of despair, that sense of almost heartbrokenness over what many people were anxious was going to be the collapse of democracy, not only far away, but perhaps even closer to home. It seemed to me that this was a moment that we should consult some important authorities. When you are in doubt, you turn to the past. And why? Because who we are is who we were. And who could speak more directly and from more trying experience on the subject of democracy than Abraham Lincoln? And so piece by piece, and it really began as pieces rather than a coherent scaffolding, piece by piece, the book came together as I found ways of addressing different aspects of this democratic experiment and how Lincoln responded to them. And that eventually became our ancient faith. Borrowing a phrase from Lincoln's great speech at Peoria on October 16th, 1854, in which he talked about the American democratic experiment, especially as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, as quite literally, he said that's our ancient faith. It's a political conviction, but it runs so deep to the marrow of our bones that we can only compare it to the tenacity with which religious faith is held. And that became then the guiding light that gave unity to the book. A man who was talking about an ancient faith. Ancient, well, yes, the Declaration of Independence is not ancient. And 1776 did not happen all that long ago, and certainly was a lot closer to Lincoln in time. But I think what Lincoln really wanted to express when he used the word ancient was not just 1776, but that democracy itself was an expression of the natural impulse of human beings and political organizations. It was the most desirable way of expressing those natural rights that Jefferson talked about in the Declaration and which were so important to Lincoln. So it's ancient, but it is a faith. It is something to be participated in. It is something to be embraced and to be held on to with tremendous amount of stubbornness and tenacity and resilience. And that Lincoln said, that describes what we want to do with this experiment. It has to be our ancient faith. And so there you have the book in a nutshell.
Well, and to your point, I think Lincoln is one of those pivotal figures that is great to return to, and especially in challenging times. And you really reflect in this book. You note that there are some differences, but also some similarities in the circumstances that Lincoln and his contemporaries found themselves in compared to where we're at in the 21st century.
Certainly.
And one description that really stuck with me, you described this 18th century, quote, sense that political orders tend downward toward decay and denigration, rather than evolving upwards into something different and improved. And you noted that this was something that Lincoln came up in and had to grapple with.
Yes.
So how do you think his circumstances and the circumstances of his time helped really to shape Lincoln, knowing that this was kind of where thought was and how he dealt with that and in some cases overcame that or was shaped by that.
You might say that when you talk about decay and decline in political systems, what you're really arguing about is an argument that has its long roots in the 18th century Enlightenment. And no surprise, Lincoln was very much a man of the Enlightenment. He is a man who puts a very high price on reason, the importance of reason, how reason must govern and control passion and impulse. That's a very Enlightenment way of talking about things that the romantic rebellion of the 19th century wanted to glorify. But it's a very Enlightenment way of construing things. The Enlightenment had, I suppose we could say, two very general ways of understanding historical development. One of them belonged to the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico. Vico talked very frankly about cycles in history. And in that respect, what you see in the environment around you should be understood as something which is always going to have a certain amount of entropy. It is always going to be declining. And what you want to do in that environment of decline is constantly ask, how do we reverse the decline? And over again, people in the 18th century who thought in this fashion said, well, what you do is you recur to first principles. You go back to the starting point. You say, this is what was originally intended. We have to make sure that that is safeguarded, and we have to make sure that is respected. Now, another way of thinking this way in the Enlightenment is probably its best example is Edward Gibbon in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. For although Gibbon is talking about the decline and fall of an empire, nevertheless, what pervades Gibbon's great treatise is his sense of confidence that eventually, sooner or later, we keep moving upwards. And Gibbon had a lot of confidence that in the 18th century, the prizes that had been won in terms of our political understanding we're not going to be abandoned. We were not going to imitate what happened with Rome. Thomas Jefferson, who acts as something of a guidepost for Lincoln this way, tended to use both. Sometimes you will hear him speaking about his anxiety over decline, and that is something which seems to be quite apparent in parts of the Declaration of Independence. There are other moments then when he speaks about the American Republic where he's very confident that we're not going to be taking any steps backwards. Lincoln is not so sure about the not any steps backwards. Lincoln can see on the landscape of his times a great deal that worried him about how the original principles of the Declaration were being sold at discount. And there are moments when he accuses Stephen A. Douglas in his great debates with Douglas in 1858 of doing exactly that, of selling out the principles of the Declaration. There are other moments when he will say that the real cure here is to recover the original plan of the founders. That's what animates his famous Cooper Institute address in February of 1861, the speech which he said, quite frankly, made him president. And there's a real sense in which that's true. But Lincoln tends toward the view of understanding history and the history of politics as an affair in which people can start out with good principles, but for a variety of reasons, principles will decay. They'll yield to other voices. Their circumstances will undermine or subvert their original commitment to those principles. And at that moment, Lincoln believed people have to be recalled to the original design. And he really believed that that was what he was doing, especially on the subject of slavery, because he was convinced from the get-go. Slavery was never the plan of the founders. Slavery was something they had on the ground when the American Republic became independent, and they were compelled simply by the virtue of it being there to tolerate it. But the expectation was that this thing was so anathema to the principles of the American Republic that it was going to die out on its own. And Lincoln himself had said, the reason why I wasn't in the forefront of opposition to slavery before 1854 was that up until that point, I had been perfectly confident that slavery was on its way out, an antiquated system that was going to eventually extinguish itself because it was so utterly incompatible with the principles on which our democratic republic had been founded. And it was a great shock to him in the year 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act to find Stephen Douglas and the United States Congress and the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, signing legislation that would have at least opened the possibility of legalizing slavery in the Western territories. At that moment, the scales fell from Lincoln's eyes. And it was like, oh, no. These people are not going away quietly. Slavery is not going away quietly. They are determined to expand slavery through the rest of the country. And once they have that planted in the Western territories, those territories become states. They become slave states. They'll turn around and they'll force the repeal of all the free state statutes, and the whole country, north and south alike, west and east, will become the preserve of legalized slavery. People at one point, when he spoke in this way in 1858, said, oh, you're exaggerating. This is too radical. And he said, oh, no, this is the way I see things tending. And if we keep on going in this way, that's where we're going to wind up. That sense that you have to recur to first principles, that you have to use the original principles of the Republic to cure this falling away, this decline. That is what animates Lincoln's campaign in 1858, his presidential campaign in 1860, and everything that he is trying to do during his presidency.
Absolutely. Well, and in your work, Alan, you bring up that the concept of consent is important in understanding Lincoln's ideas of both democracy and slavery. Would you mind sharing more about that with us?
When you look through the 8 volumes plus 2 supplemental volumes of the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, you're going to be surprised to find that he doesn't use the word democracy actually all that often. If you run a search through the text, you find out he actually uses the word democracy only 137 times. And he only ever comes close to offering his own definition of democracy one time. And that's in notes that he jots down in 1858, in which he says, and this is, as I say, the closest he comes to a definition, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. What's bound up with that statement? Well, you've got to pick some parts of it up into their separate pieces, because it's a negative definition, for one thing. He's talking about what democracy is not. He says, if you don't want to be a slave, don't be a master. Don't consent one way or the other. Because for him, the notion of consent is really what lies as the bedrock of any democratic experiment. It's the consent of the governed that Jefferson described in the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. What he's really trying to capture with that negative definition of democracy is that everything else that goes into the making of democracy really flows downstream from that fundamental idea, the consent of the governed. It's not a matter of kings or dictators or despots or counts or princes or what have you, from on high, looking down at the body of the people and telling them what to do. If anything, it has to flow the other way. It's the people. When they agree to a certain set of procedures, that is real and legitimate government. That is real and legitimate democracy. Slavery is the ultimate contradiction of that, because slavery contains no aspect of consent whatsoever. No slave consents to be a slave. That was what made slavery, in Lincoln's mind, so very near kin to monarchy. Because what else does a monarch do? What else does a king do? What else is the spirit of monarchy about, except saying, and Lincoln, in fact, will use this when he is debating with Douglas, you toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it. Whether, he said, whether it comes from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race. It is the same tyrannical principle. That is all about the erasure of consent. If you want to have genuine democratic government, it has to be consent, and that means that you have to consent to obtain the consent of others. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Everything runs downhill from there.
Well, and you also wrote that, quote, Lincoln did not merely espouse democracy, even though he may not have used the words. You said that he did not merely espouse democracy. He looked like democracy.
Oh, he did. Oh,
And I love that. And I was wondering if you would tell us, how did you find that Lincoln embodied his concept and understanding of democracy? And how did his contemporaries recognize that quality in him?
well, we are so familiar with the image of Lincoln on the $5 bill and the Lincoln Memorial. Every time you get commercials on television for President's Day, there's somebody with a stovepipe hat and a very fake looking beard. So we're very familiar with Lincoln. He doesn't, if he walked around among us today, it wouldn't jar us because we're just used to that. But oh my goodness, in his day, bear in mind, the man starting off is 6 feet 4 inches tall. This at a time when average male height was about 5'8" in America. And that, of course, was even taller than in Europe. Only, oh my goodness, a decade before Lincoln was born, recruits in Italy for Napoleon's army, their average height was 5 feet. All right, here's Lincoln, 6'4". And not only 6'4", but look at the way he's built. If you look at the number of images which show Lincoln at full length, there are several photographs. You realize that the man's height was all in his legs. I mean, when he sat down, it didn't seem like he was all that much larger than other people. It was when he stood up. He just kept going up and up and up and up. He was flat-footed. There was nothing distinctive or martial about the way he walked. And his manner, I mean, his speaking voice, for one thing. We tend to have this image of Lincoln as having this big, booming, operatic voice. No. People who heard Lincoln speak remarked on the fact that he had a very high-pitched voice. And not only high-pitched, but almost kind of scratchy. Now, it had the virtue of being, for that reason, penetrating. He could be heard at great distances, which in those huge outdoor debates of 1858 was a real advantage for him.
Yeah.
But he didn't sound like a commanding presence. And when he did speak, what came out had this extraordinarily pronounced border state accent. I mean, he's born in Kentucky. He's raised in southern Indiana, but this is still the border. He moves to Illinois. It's the middle of Illinois, which is still very much what in the 19th century we could call the border. So when he talks, very thick accent. Now, there are no surviving recordings of Abraham Lincoln. We only missed him by 15 years because Edison was making the first recordings of voices in 1880. So if Lincoln had lived a little longer, we might have actually been able to capture his voice. But what we do have are a lot of descriptions of it, and a couple of people who actually tried to do some phonetic renderings. George Templeton Strong, in his diary. Templeton Strong was a New York lawyer and music critic, the elite of the elite. He visited the White House on behalf of the United States Sanitary Commission during the war. And he was struck by Lincoln's way of speaking. And he tried to get it phonetically in his diary. And it came out something like, "Well, I never cross a river until I come to it." All right, imagine the impact of that on elite Harvardians and Princetonians and whatnot. Even in 1861 to 62, people shook their heads and they said, "What? Where did they get this guy? He sounds like something from the backwoods." Julia Ward Howe, whom we remember as the authoress of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, visited the White House in November of 1861. She was very put off by the way Lincoln spoke because he would respond and say, "I heard that." And it was like, we elected this as president of the United States? What a joke. The thing is that Lincoln knew that was how people were going to respond to him. And he let them. He let them underestimate him. And when they underestimated him, faster than they could have described it, he had them all trussed up and doing his bidding, outmaneuvered them, outguessed them. You did not fool lightly with Lincoln. He was a very shrewd, as his law partner Herndon said, very shrewd, long-headed man. And even though he sounded as common could be, there was also a tremendous intelligence at work there. So you would look at Lincoln and you'd look at him walk. You'd look at him try to ride a horse. That was, people always regarded that as being something very funny because those enormously long legs, his knees would be up near the pommel of the saddle. They'd listen to him talk and they'd think, this is just a very common man. Well, he was a common man, but he was an uncommon common man. So yes, he sounds like democracy, but he also thinks the way democracy can think at its most shrewd and calculating, in the best sense of the word.
Well, and we talked a little of this when we were discussing kind of the ideas that were going about that Lincoln came up in, these ideas and concepts. But while I realize that some of these may be more familiar to our listeners than others, would you mind sharing with us a little about the key intellectual influences on Lincoln's concept of democracy that you found in your research?
Certainly the most important influence for Lincoln is Thomas Jefferson, because it is Jefferson he comes back to repeatedly over the years. In 1859, in a letter he writes to Henry Pierce in Boston, Pierce was organizing a Jefferson Festival in Boston in April of 1859. He invited Lincoln to come and participate. Lincoln wrote back and said, no, the calendar is already committed that way, but let me tell you what I think of Jefferson. Jefferson, he said, is the author of the definitions and axioms of liberty. So when he looks at Thomas Jefferson, he sees very much the author of the Declaration of Independence. And his constant point of reference is to that declaration. Almost 2 years after he wrote that letter, he's on his inaugural trip from his home in Illinois to Washington, D.C. He comes through Philadelphia on February 22nd, Washington's birthday. So they arrange a ceremony at Independence Hall for him to raise the flag outside Independence Hall for Washington's birthday. And in the course of his visit to Philadelphia and his visit to Independence Hall, he says there that he had never had a thought politically that did not spring for what went on in that building. So for Lincoln, Jefferson, the Declaration, these are the pole stars that he steers by. But then, beyond that, there is a very long line of intellectual influences on Lincoln. Again, people who might meet him casually or might hear him talk might think, oh, this man can't be any kind of thinker. Oh, no, said Herndon, no. Lincoln thought more than any man in America, and he read a great deal more than we suspect. Mind you, in his speeches, he doesn't do footnotes. We could wish he did, but he didn't. But we can pick up traces of all kinds of interesting influences on Lincoln, and they run the gamut from Shakespeare and he adored Shakespeare and poetry, and it's poetry all the way from Byron to Alexander Pope. But it's also philosophy, and in particular, it's political economy. A number of observers said that on political economy, Lincoln was great. And Herndon provided us with a list of some of the most important treatises of the 19th century on political economy that Lincoln consulted. He talked about Lincoln's admiration for Francis Wayland's book on political economy from 1835. Wayland was the president of Brown University at that point. But not only Wayland, particularly Herndon singled out John Stuart Mill. And it's probably no accident that many years before, Lincoln had been in a discussion with the journalist Noah Brooks. And Brooks asked him, what books were really influential for you? And one of the ones that Lincoln responded by identifying was John Stuart Mill. And the confirmation of that comes, curiously enough, in a speech he gives in 1859 at the Wisconsin State Agricultural Fair in Milwaukee. Because there's part of a paragraph in that speech that's, I hesitate to use the word plagiarize, but frankly, he lifts a good part of it from Mill's, the 1848 American edition of John Stuart Mill's Political Economy. And he uses that. Well, yes, today we would say he ought to have footnoted it. Well, I'm going to simply assume that what Lincoln is doing is tipping his hat to John Stuart Mill. But as soon as you've made lists like this, you begin to realize that Lincoln read a whole lot more widely and deeply than people were initially inclined to give him credit. A British journalist named George Borrett came to visit Lincoln at the summer White House in 1864, the so-called soldiers' home on what was then the outskirts of Washington. And Borrett arrived expecting he was going to meet some pioneer character who was going to talk in accents familiar to us from Davy Crockett. And he was taken aback, first of all, by Lincoln's, what he called very shrewd observations, comparing British and American law. Who would have thought? And then Lincoln rounds it all out by reciting off from memory a big chunk of Alexander Pope's essay on man. And Borrett came away from that interview, you can almost hear the eyeballs jingling in his head, like, I wasn't expecting this from the man Lincoln, who I have been told by so many other people is just a frontier ignoramus. Oh, no, nothing of the sort. So you discover in Lincoln these hidden lights. He was a voracious reader, and not only that, equipped with a very powerful memory, so that what he read, he absorbed and kept. And those things inform Lincoln over and over and over again in his political life. And you see them played out at many different points, even during his presidency.
Oh, yes. Well, and you note at one point that, quote, given how much Lincoln is celebrated as the champion of democratic politics, it will be easy to miss the ways Lincoln's prescriptions for government are wound around economic issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to ask you, what ties did you find between Lincoln's concepts and economic issues? And what does it mean for us to examine Lincoln's career and legacy through an economic lens?
Lincoln always thought the most remarkable thing he could say about his own life was how different it had turned out from the way it began. He's born as the son of a hardscrabble farmer, quite literally in the backwoods of Kentucky and then of southern Indiana. And it wasn't just that life was hard. It was full of people who, we might say, misbehaved by the standards of polite society, even in Lincoln's day. We sometimes glorify the frontier, the John Wayne kind of thing, as that was where all the noble and upright people behaved. Lincoln did not have that opinion of the life he led growing up on the frontier. The life of farming in the backwoods of Kentucky and Indiana was for him a life marked by hardship. It's marked by violence, often very random violence. It's marked by drunkenness. It's marked by all kinds of sexual irregularities. He did not glorify it. We today look back and say, Abraham Lincoln born in a log cabin, isn't that sweet? He would not have agreed with that. One neighbor of his, years later in Springfield, Illinois, who wanted to press him about what it was like when he was growing up, Lincoln didn't want to give an answer. He summed it all up by saying, I have seen a great deal of the backsides of the world. That's not a compliment.
No.
even of his father, with whom he did not have the best relationship. Even of his father, he said that his father only knew enough to bunglingly sign his own name. That doesn't speak of an atmosphere in which aspiration for self-improvement means a whole lot. And yet what marks Lincoln almost from the start is that determination to improve himself, to transform himself. And what Lincoln saw, looking back on his own life, as one of the great virtues of the American experience was that openness to self-making, to self-transformation, that you weren't condemned to be what your parents and grandparents and ancestors had been. There were no social restraints that way. Talent could insist upon making itself heard and understood. When he talked about the ideal notion of an economy, he reduced it down to a formula that It sounded something like this. The penniless beggar and beginner starts out with nothing, has to start out working for somebody else. But that patient and ambitious beginner saves up from what he has earned being paid by somebody else as wages. He saves up. And he saves up enough to strike out on his own. And then as he's successful, he's able to build up on that. And the more successful he becomes, the more able he is to employ other penniless beginners who then start their trajectory upwards. And he said, that is the true system, and may it go on and on and on. Now, of course, you might at that point say, well, yes, that's not a guarantee of success for everybody. Some people don't particularly have much ambition. They're content for come day, go day, God send Sunday. And then there are other people who just, what they attempt to do just does not succeed. And in that Wisconsin State Agricultural Fair address, Lincoln speaks to that. And I can't say that he speaks to it in the most comforting of terms, because he says for those who simply by nature are subservient, who don't have any ambition for themselves, there's no surprise then that they're not going to advance in life. And then there are other people who meet these unfortunate reverses. And to them, he says, don't blame the system. The system is not at fault. Go back to work, start over, and the motto is better luck next time. Well, that doesn't really sound like a whole lot of sympathy. But to him, that was integral to this notion of you start out with nothing, but you in the democratic environment, you are able to acquire something and make of yourself something that you had not been before, and maybe something that other people really were interested in seeing you become. But you could do that because there were no restraints. There was no aristocracy. There was no ceiling that would hold you to a certain level. And Lincoln devoutly believed that. And he said, I want that to be for everyone. And he added in a speech he gave to workers who were on strike, curiously enough, in New Haven, Connecticut. He said, I want that for the black man, too. He's entitled to that as well. At which point, you can almost hear people standing back. What? The black man, too? And Lincoln? Yes. To him, that kind of economic recreation of oneself can only happen in a democratic environment where people consent to how they are governed, consent not only to the politics per se, but also to the economic order in which they participate. And for him, that described not just the genius of American life, it described his own experience. Because what else had he done but rise from these extremely humble, almost to him, embarrassing origins, to become the Honorable A. Lincoln, Esquire, a member of Congress, a candidate for the Senate, and, of course, eventually, 16th President of the United States. For him, economy and democracy, these were two halves of the same coin.
Yeah, and you do a great job in your book of highlighting how some of this is reflected in his presidency.
Oh, yes. You look at the policies that he wants to put in place. He wants, first of all, as his Whig forebears and the Whig party people whom he admired the most insisted, he wanted there to be strong protective tariffs because he wanted to keep out the overwhelming competition that would have poured from the British Industrial Revolution all through the American economy and made the American economy dependent on Great Britain. No, for him, economics was also linked to a sense of the security of American independence. So you wanted to build up manufacturing. You wanted to build up independent production. You wanted to protect farmers. All right, so you are going to impose tariffs, and no surprise, the tariff rates that the Lincoln administration puts into place are the highest in American history. Some of the tariff rates really approached as high as 49%. He not only that wants tariffs to protect, he wants infrastructure. And especially given his experience in Illinois as a lawyer for the railroads, he wants railroad construction. So it's under his administration that we will see one of the great infrastructure projects of American history, and that is the Transcontinental Railroad authorized. Had he not met so tragic an end at Ford's Theater in 1865, I can almost picture Abraham Lincoln being on hand at Promontory Point in 1869 for that famous meeting of the Union and Central Pacific Railroads. I could almost see the old rail splitter volunteering to wield the maul that would drive that golden spike, uniting both halves of the North American continent. So he is very encouraging of government involvement and support for the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad and so many other infrastructure projects as well. He almost argues that if there had been decent infrastructure projects in the Upper South, especially, that would have bound the South to the future of the North, you would not have had civil war. You would not have had secession because the two parts of the country would have been so closely knit together by their economic infrastructure. He also wants national banking. It strikes us as strange today. There is no national banking. There was no Federal Reserve System of any sort as Lincoln is coming to political maturity. In fact, it surprises people to learn that one of the most popular periodicals of the day were the bank circular issues every month. And what the bank circulars did was to identify how reliable certain kinds of paper money were. There was paper money in Lincoln's day, but it was paper money issued by banks, not by the United States Treasury. So there was always a question: if somebody from Maine showed up in your store in Illinois and wanted to hand you Maine banknotes, could you trust them? Maybe it was from a bank that had gone up and was no longer in existence. So you had to dive down beneath your counter and get out the bank circular, look it up, and see whether it was still good, at least up to that month. And Lincoln says that's no way to conduct national commerce. That's leaving the whole notion of commerce across the nation up for grabs. Now, what we need a consistent system of national money, a national circulating medium. And while he does not find himself able to persuade people to adopt the idea of a national bank on the model, let's say, of Alexander Hamilton, nevertheless, he does push through a National Banking Act, which creates a national currency. This was what was called the greenbacks. And we've been functioning with that national currency ever since. And of course, it makes it very easy for someone from Maine to go to Illinois and buy goods, because the same money that you were paid in Maine and take to Illinois is going to be accepted by a storekeeper in Illinois. What does that do except make economic exchange all the more easy? So infrastructure, banking, tariffs, these, whether we notice it or not, are key features of Lincoln's presidency, and they're reflective of his own economic thinking. We think of the Lincoln administration as bound up so much with the Civil War and winning the war and battlefields and generals and so on like that. Yeah, I think there's a good argument to be made for how, even if there had been no Civil War, Lincoln's administration would still be one of these hinge presidencies. His election would have been one of these tectonic elections in American life, simply because of the extraordinary economic agenda which Lincoln wanted to put in place. So the Civil War, yes, very important. I'm not by any means diminishing that. But the noise and the drums and the bugles of the war have sometimes distracted our attention from the really extraordinary economic accomplishments of the Lincoln administration. And these are economic accomplishments which really govern American life for the next 60 years. And really, in many respects, even up until today.
As you make those points about the impact of Lincoln's presidency, towards the end of your work, you ask the question that I think everyone who has studied Lincoln ponders at some point.
Oh, no, I can tell. I know where this is going. because as I think I say in the book, almost every place I go, the question I know I'm going to be asked is, what if Lincoln had lived?
Yeah.
What would have happened?
Yeah. Sometimes
people say, if there's a particular moment in history that you could go back to, where would you go? And I said, I know exactly where I'd go. It would be April 14th, 1865, Ford's Theater, and I would lock John Wilkes Booth in the men's room. I don't know if they had a men's room in 1865 before its theater, but if there was something like that, a closet, I don't care. I'd lock him in there. I'd throw away the key.
Yes.
Because when you reflect on what actually did happen, the years that follow on our great Civil War were years of misdirection. They were years of mistakes. They were years of suffering. And so much of the product of what we call Reconstruction still hangs around our necks like historical millstones. And even if you don't want to take a flyer and say, this is what Lincoln would have done, nevertheless, you can't avoid the conclusion that we certainly couldn't have done worse than we did. I think there are some things, and this is speculation, so I'm going to step out of my historian's boots and step into, I'm not entirely sure what other kind of boots or slippers I'm putting on when I do this, maybe something like from Aladdin's lamp. But I think there's some things we could speculate, and I think could logically see Lincoln doing. I think he would certainly put his shoulder to the wheel of black civil rights. Even at the very end, in the last year of his presidency, he's beginning to talk about something that at the beginning of that presidency would have been unthinkable, and that is black voting rights, education opportunities for the freed slaves. The very last speech he gives in public on April 11th, 1865, has both of those elements in it. And even in practical terms, it would make perfect sense for Lincoln to want to push in that direction. I think he would also have wanted to think about ways of economic enablement for the freed slaves, because he understood, certainly as well, if not better than others, how closely bound up political life and economic life was. If you want people to have a secure place politically, there also needs to be an accompanying economic place. How do you get that economic place in the 19th century? You do it through land. The United States, even in Lincoln's day, is still overwhelmingly an agricultural nation. We don't really become a great industrial behemoth until much later in the 19th century. So, although sometimes people like to talk about the Civil War as the war of the industrial North against the agricultural South, I think that's a wild exaggeration. It was really a war between two agricultural systems, North and South. So, what do you do if you want to promote economic empowerment? It's going to have to come in the form of land. Where's that land going to come from? Well, it could quite conceivably have come from the seizures of lands owned by Confederates who were, quite technically speaking, guilty of treason, many of whom went into exile. Their lands were liable to confiscation under the laws that had been passed during the war. And I think there's a real possibility in which you could see Lincoln working very hard to make sure that these former Confederate estates and properties were now going to be thrown open for occupation and ownership by the freed slaves. You see a glimmering of this in experiments that are undertaken in South Carolina and in Georgia. Especially you see it in General Sherman's famous Field Order Number 15, which talks about dividing a very wide swathe of the Georgia and Carolina coastlines into 40-acre plots for the freed slaves. This is, by the way, the origin of the 40 acres and a mule. And I don't think it's stretching things too much to see Lincoln finding that to be a very agreeable way to proceed. All of that, by the way, gets erased, gets negated by Andrew Johnson when Johnson amnesties the Confederate leadership, because the amnesty comes with a restoration of property titles, except in certain specific cases. I think that would not be beyond the realm of imagination to see Lincoln doing that. So there are some directions that I think Lincoln would have moved. And yet, even saying that, Jerry, the problems of Reconstruction are so mountainous that they might have defied even the political skills of an Abraham Lincoln to solve. After all, if he had obeyed the what was then unspoken, two-term rule, he would only have been president until the 4th of March, 1869. It's not a whole lot of time in which to remake an entire section of the country, because that's what it would have been. That's what it would have required. So perhaps there would not have been enough time. Perhaps there would not have been enough in the way of his own magic. to make the kind of differences that we would like to dream about, that might have headed off so many of the domestic crises and difficulties and conflicts that we deal with even to this day. Perhaps, and maybe all we can say is perhaps.
Well, and I think that's what readers can get from your book, that, even though Lincoln stands out in history, he is still just one man at this one time. He's part of a larger history and legacy and society, culture, economy that's still moving forward and that sometimes can be out of our control. But I think you help us to understand what he brings to the table. And Alan, as we wrap up our conversation, I want to bring up this idea of the Lincolnian democracy that you ended your work with. How do you think this concept of the Lincolnian democracy differs from where we're at in the 21st century? And what do you believe is the key takeaway for readers of your work?
Well, I would think that one of the most important things that a Lincolnian sense of democracy would be built around would be that guiding principle of the consent of the governed. I think it's agreed on almost all hands that American society, as we live in it today, is an extremely complicated, extremely complex, extremely interdependent society in which ordinary individuals suddenly sometimes quake in their boots at the thought of, how do we govern? How do you govern something as complicated as what we find today? And yet Lincoln will insist, no, the bedrock of a democracy has to be that consent of the governed. There cannot be a fourth estate, however you want to define it, which does the governing apart from the people at large. That can't be. So one thing that we need to keep in view in terms of a Lincolnian democracy is, how close are we hewing to the consent of the governed? And if the governed themselves are reduced simply to the status of worker bees in a society, then what you have is not a democracy. What you have is a hive. I don't want to live in a hive. I want to live in a democracy. Because I think fundamentally, and I think that Lincoln also believed this, that in a democracy you have the opportunity to realize the full potential of those natural rights that Jefferson described in the Declaration of Independence. It is the most natural way for human beings to live in political society. All right, that's one thing, consent of the governed. Another thing is transformation. I think what we should look for is a society whose economy is constantly opening the possibility of transformation to people. How do you enable, how do you empower people to realize the full capacities of their gifts, their talents, and their ambitions? Now, people will look at that and say, well, that's going to involve a lot of rocking of boats. That's going to allow a lot of people down there at the bottom maybe to rise at the top, and that's going to threaten us. All right, let it threaten. One of the things that some people I hear sometimes complain about is how success goes from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in just 3 generations. Well, I don't know that I mourn that necessarily. I'm sure in some respects it's painful for the people by the 3rd or 4th generation. Yet at the same time, it's a system of constant renewal, of constant newness, of constant freshness. And it's a system which looks beyond the superficial and rewards desire. It rewards appeal. It rewards hard work and dedication. And it seems to me that those are the virtues that make a democracy flourish. So you see, it works both ways. Democracy encourages that kind of human flourishing, that kind of self-transformation, but self-transformation is also constantly renewing the oxygen of the democratic atmosphere. And it seems to me that those two things are ways that a democracy, our democracy, can really go to be a Lincolnian democracy. I think a third thing would be to consider some of the personal qualities of Abraham Lincoln, which seem to me to be quintessentially democratic qualities. Qualities like resilience, his capacity to absorb punishment, not to be constantly sticking to his prerogatives, but always willing to say, I might be wrong, always willing to say, I would like to hear what you have to say. And if you disagree with me, I can handle that without wanting to cut your head off. Resilient. That kind of thing is in short supply in many places in our system. But it should be a cardinal aspect of it. Humility. I don't mean the false humility of people who think that if they kiss the babies and shake the hands, that's going to get them elected. I mean a humility that understands your own limitations. Lincoln responded to an angry letter from a Unionist in Louisiana in July of 1862. And at the end of it, he said something I thought was really extraordinary. I shall do nothing in malice. What we deal with is too great for malicious dealing. I like the malice toward none aspect of that, but what I also like even better is his sense what we are dealing with is too great for malicious dealing. And then I think of his humor. Sometimes Lincoln's humor was borrowed from joke books and things. Other times, he could put the one-liner in just where it was needed. My favorite is a story about how one fine day, radical Republican Senator Ben Wade stormed down from the Capitol building down Pennsylvania Avenue, went into Lincoln's office, proceeded to tell Lincoln everything he was doing wrong. Lincoln stopped him and said, "Senator, that reminds me of a story." And Wade erupted. "Lincoln, I am sick and tired of hearing your stories. Don't you know that hell is not half a mile off?" Lincoln responded, "Senator, isn't that the distance between here and the Capitol?" In that sense of humor, he introduces a sense of proportion. He lowers temperatures. He lets us see us as we are. Those are qualities that are very different from the way totalitarians rule. Totalitarians rule by honor, by violence, by perception. They like to project strength. Now, ironically, it's almost always a very fragile strength. But they like to project strength because they're afraid of their own fragility. But that's not what Lincoln was, and I think that's not what a democracy should be. A democracy should be about resilience, about humility, about humor. Those are personal qualities. I can talk about policies that politicians might adopt, but these are personal qualities that all of us who want a democracy to flourish should study for ourselves. So there is a job here not only for America as a whole, in recurring to Lincolnian principles, but also a personal task for all of us to see and hold up Lincoln as a mirror in which we hope we can also see ourselves.
Alan, thank you so much for this journey into the past, this thought-provoking and insightful journey in your work, in this conversation, to help us to reflect on where we've been and the inspiration that we can draw from Lincoln as we move on in our day.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry.
And for our listeners, the book is Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. We only scratched the surface of what all is in this work, so I highly recommend you checking it out. Alan, thank you so much again. Thank you for joining us on Presidencies.
Very good.
Thanks so much again to Alan Guelzo for a wonderful discussion and for the time and insight that he shared with all of us. Be sure to check out his latest book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment, to dive further into Alan's work researching Lincoln and his conception of democracy. I'll have a link to the publisher's website on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, so that you can get a copy of your very own. Special thanks again to Micah Kelsey from Alfred A. Knopf for working to bring Alan and me together for this conversation. If you'd like to find other episodes of the podcast, links to more information about all the American presidents, or learn how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the work of the Presidencies Podcast, just go to the website, presidenciespodcast.com. Thank you so much to all of our patrons, as well as folks who have left ratings and reviews on their podcast app of choice to help folks know why they too should be listening to the Presidencies Podcast. Likewise, thanks so much to everyone who has shared information about the podcast, either on social media or in your offline life with friends, families, and colleagues who love deep dives into history. It takes a village to get the word out there. Last but certainly not least, I thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.